Sigmund Freud came up with the concept of transference, which is the emotions and the experiences that are brought up in the client, he called it analysand, that are projected onto the analyst. That's transference. Mm-hmm. It's transferred on. He also came up with the concept of countertransference, which is the issues that come up in the therapist in relation to the patient or analysand. And he came up with two types of countertransference. One is what the client induces just by who they are and what they're bringing in. And the other is really comes out of the analyst's vulnerability because of their own traumas and their own childhood issues and so on. Most people who use the term countertransference don't even realize that it's a Freudian term, and mm-hmm. some people who use it really don't like Freudian theory, which is interesting in and of itself. In Brainspotting, we talk about limbic countertransference. Now, what is limbic countertransference? Why did I give it that name? Well, the limbic system is meant to scan to pick up for potential danger or threat, and when it's picked up, to really go into a state of alert so that all of the body processes getting ready for flight first, not fight. It's not fight or flight, it's flight or fight, because all humans and mammals are not looking to fight, we're looking to be safe. And the best way to be safe is to create distance from yourself from that which is dangerous. Fight is only when you're cornered and you can't, if you've ever seen your dog or cat, when they seem cornered, you see this very frightening kind of reaction. That's the fight response. And freeze is another one. That's when flight is not possible and freeze is not, and fight is not possible. But when a therapist sits in psychotherapy with a client, and the client brings in things that are painful, that are frightening, if they are an abuse survivor, if they've had terrible physical accidents and traumas and so on, if they're involved in an existential trauma like 9/11 or a school shooting, things like this, just hearing this material, there's the empathic part of the therapist, which is very limbic, and the very human part of the therapist is going to get triggered by this. Okay, you hear these stories and you get images in your head, and you may hear sounds, you may get smells and things like that. But if it touches on something where you're vulnerable, if you had some terrible things happen to you in childhood, and your client is talking about these things, it's going to activate your limbic system. It's going to bring your limbic system into a state of threat, and in the threat response. That's what we call limbic countertransference. It's countertransference because the therapist is safe, just like the client is safe. You're sitting there in an office and you're just conversing and you're there about healing. However, these stories, in the neocortex, we can tell ourselves, oh, I'm fine, I'm sitting here and everything like this, but that information doesn't travel too much down there. We will unknowingly, unconsciously relive a lot of the client's experiences, especially if it triggers our own vulnerabilities. So our limbic system gets activated just like we're under threat. But what happens when you work with this client for 10 sessions, 20 sessions, 50 sessions? You get this continued exposure. There's a cumulative effect to it. And also, most of us are in practice, so we'll go from one session, with a client to the next client to the next client, and somebody else comes in and they're bringing in their own issues. It's not terrible stuff in every session, but there's a lot. This is what therapy is about. This is what people come for. And in that context, we get limbically activated all the time, and much more than we know it. So what happens in limbic countertransference is that we go into subtle forms of flight or fight, or subtle forms of freeze, but it happens without us knowing it until it's pretty, clear. And sometimes it takes a long time to catch the tail of that experience. And what happens as therapists? Well, since all therapy is about attunement, relational attunement, and brain spotting is about the neurobiological attunement, when your limbic system gets activated and it's all about survival, your own or our own capacity to attune drops down. okay? And if it's activated enough, it can drop down to a baseline of 0. What is the flight experience of limbic countertransference? Well, the simplest thing is when you want to get out of the room. Or you look at the clock and there's, 20 minutes to go and you can't wait for it to be over. You want out of that situation. And that's very natural and very human. The fight response tends to be especially when you have clients who are provocative or can be aggressive or challenging, when instead of just sort of staying empathic and sort of receiving it, you start to, probably in subtle forms, fight back, or become a little bit argumentative or challenging. Or sometimes if you get into a real struggle with a client, that's a manifestation of the fight response. Freeze response is when you start to not be able to think. When you lose track of things. It's like a dissociative phenomenon. But I call it cotton head, where you feel like your head is filled with cotton. And, client just is talking to you and then you lose what they're saying, and then they ask you about something that they said and you have no idea what it was, which happens to all of us, even the most experienced ones and even the leaders in the field. That's a manifestation of the freeze response. And these are all parts of limbic countertransference. What Freud said, which is very true and very empathic, is that countertransference is unavoidable. It's ubiquitous. It's going to happen. It's not like it kind of happens sometimes or it kind of happens to some therapists. It happens to all therapists. So in that context, we need to be looking for it all the time. And when we look for it and we find it, just the awareness is the most important thing. But if we find that there are certain things that trigger us, sometimes if it's enough, you need to do some work on it yourself, by yourself. And if that isn't enough, you need to see a supervisor. And if that isn't enough, you need to see a therapist. Just because these issues, you're not just doing it for your client, you're doing it for yourself. Because these are things that have been unearthed because of the continual exposure through our client work. Brainspotting helps with trauma. It helps with dissociation. It helps the nervous system to go from dysregulation to regulation. So a therapist who is experiencing limbic countertransference is in a state of dysregulation. It might be slight or subtle dysregulation, or it might be kind of significant or profound dysregulation. Whatever the issues are, a Brainspotting therapist who really recognizes that they have limbic countertransference, that they're not able to get past on their own. Brainspotting is a very effective way of identifying where it is in the body and the eye positions through the relationship, and to process it and see what comes out. And what comes out of the therapist going for help around their limbic countertransference with Brainspotting? Their own healing. Even more important than being able to be more effective with a client or some clients or all clients, the main thing that the therapist gets out of it is their own healing. And in some ways, having these traumas of our own unearthed becomes an opportunity for us to get healing that we wouldn't have otherwise.